Hey friends, today's scary video is sponsored by a company who specializes in something equally frightening, the prospect of below-the-waistline grooming. Well, fear not, because thanks to the little happy elves over at manscaped.com, Christmas just came early. Isn't it just the worst when you can't decide on what gift to purchase for the man in your life? Well, why not get him something he'll actually use? Because if he won't stick with that gym membership you got him last year, the least he can do is keep himself trim. This is where the Lawnmower 4.0 comes in. It's a wireless, waterproof, LED-equipped body trimmer with built-in advanced skin-safe technology, meaning your Christmas cheer won't be interrupted by Halloween screams coming from the bathroom. You could also stuff his stocking with Manscaped's Crop Preserver below-the-waist deodorant, which I'm sure both he and your nostrils will thank you for. And speaking of nostrils, Manscaped has their brand new Weed Whacker nose and ear hair trimmer, which I can personally assure you is a godsend. It is these 360-degree rotary blades and the same skin-safe technology from the trimmer, so I can trim my nose hairs without having to worry about nicks or tugs. Manscaped has also just introduced the Refined Cologne, a light yet rugged fragrance that won't just make you smell good, it'll make you feel good knowing that the hypoallergenic ingredients are cruelty-free, dye-free, and paraben-free. Oh, and it's also 100% vegan, which, as any of our earth-loving friends will tell you, is a tough find. So if you got an extra special man in your life that deserves a real treat this year, make sure to order the full performance package by Manscaped, because for a limited time only, you'll get 2 free gifts, the Shed travel bag, and the Manscaped anti-chafing boxer briefs. That might just be worth it for the anti-chafing underwear alone, because if he's a fitness freak, they might just be his new favorite thing. So, to make an already happy holidays just a little neater and tidier, go to manscaped.com and use my promo code LET'SREAD to get 20% off with free shipping and 2 free gifts. That's 20% off with free shipping and 2 free gifts when you go to manscaped.com and use my promo code LETSREAD. I've been a cop for just short of 10 years now and a homicide detective for 3. I've worked with some good cops and I've worked with some bad cops too. But there's only one guy I ever worked with who was a real blue blood. I understand that term gets thrown around a lot now, given the TV show of the same name, but in reality, there are very few of us who are born police. And no, I'm not talking about some unhealthy desire to boss folks around, although you can bet your butt I've seen a few of those. It was more like he was a natural investigator. He was cold, but curious, intelligent, but not egotistical about it. But above all, he was thorough. He would exhaust every single possibility until only one logical explanation remained: pure deduction. But every so often he pulled off a master stroke, and the way he got the ball over the line was his method of interrogation. I only got to see this firsthand one time, but my God, it was like watching an artist at work. I obviously don't think it's a good idea if I drop his name, so we'll just call him Blue Blood. And as much as I'll try to save you most of the details, because I'm not much of a true crime writer as some of you are here, here's the story of the one time I got to see Blue Blood being the box man. Just after Thanksgiving of 2001, a body turned up just outside of Mechanicsburg, PA, out near the White Rocks Trail, if any of you know the area. The body belonged to a 20-year-old girl who'd been traveling back from family visiting with her father late on Thanksgiving night. According to him, they'd gotten into an argument while driving back, and she demanded that he let her out of the car. Afraid he might cause an accident if he didn't let his hysterical daughter out of the car, he did as she asked. And that was the last time he saw her alive. The father admitted he was angry with his daughter and had at first intended to drive home without her. But after a few miles he stopped and got out his old cell phone and tried to call his daughter so he could give her a ride home, as it would be quite a walk back to Mechanicsburg. He said she sent all of his calls to voicemail, so figuring she would find her own way home, he left the area. A few days go by and no sign of his daughter, so the guy puts in a missing persons report. 2 days later, the daughter's body was found. She appeared fully clothed and had her head wrapped up in a plastic bag. The search team that first found her body obviously knew better than to touch anything, so their guess was that she'd been suffocated with it. Only when they tried to move her body did they find out that the bag was the only thing holding her skull together. They told us it looked like her skull had been smashed by one strike from an extremely heavy object. Think a fully loaded dumbbell or something. They also discovered she hadn't been wearing any underwear at the time she'd been murdered. Uniform officers canvassed the area, including some fairly secluded homes out near White Rocks. They found one guy with priors for indecent exposure and battery. They actually admitted to seeing the girl. She'd apparently knocked at his house, told him someone was following her, and asked to come inside. He then invited her in, but she became skittish, changed her mind, and ran off back down his driveway. Almost everyone involved thought it was an open and shut case. We just had to work the guy with priors until we either cracked or we found solid DNA evidence. But old Blue Blood didn't like the guy for it, at least not until he could tie up one little loose end. And when he started pulling on that one little thread, the whole sweater came falling apart to everyone's complete amazement. So what Blue Blood wanted to know was why they were out near White Rocks in the first place. I won't bore you with the nitty-gritty of rural Pennsylvania highways, but the area the father and daughter were in was basically a cul-de-sac. If you were driving from Gettysburg, where the relatives were, from Mechanicsburg, you wouldn't end up on those little back roads. Not unless you were A, totally lost, which was impossible. By his own admission, the father made round trips to Gettysburg 3 or 4 times a year, therefore he knew it well. B, had taken several wrong turns, not likely, but feasible given that they were in a state of distress while driving at night. Or C, the mystery reason. That's not my phrasing, by the way, that's old Blue Blood's. He was convinced there was another reason they were out near White Rocks, and he was determined to find out what it was. Following his lead, we end up questioning a handful of people closest to the father and daughter. As you can imagine, the first person on that list was the girl's mom, but she was out of the picture for some reason. Friends and relatives had no idea why she'd abandoned the family, and when we asked the girl's father, he respectfully declined to talk about it. They hadn't spoken in years, and he had no contact details for her. All he could say was that her best bet was asking her elderly parents who lived up in Minnesota. But it was during one of those interviews that Blue Blood mentioned something to one of the mom's friends about the father-daughter relationship, as he put it. Stepdaughter, she said. That was the first time we'd heard that term used. Not a single person either knew or cared to tell us that the father and daughter were not blood relatives. And when the father had married into the family when the daughter was still very young, he'd taken the mom's name instead of her taking his. That was the switch. On the drive back to the precinct, Blue Blood had this look in his eye that reminded me of hunting trips with my grandpa. He was quiet, focused, very visibly tense, not because he was stalking a deer with a whiny grandchild threatening to screw the whole thing up. It was because he was thinking. He was thinking about why a man would change his last name to fit the family he just married into. And sure, I wondered that too. I mean, the guy is free to do whatever he wants within reason. This is America. So as strange as it was, I didn't see how that could ever be a piece of the puzzle. But the Blue Blood, it was an unturned stone, so to speak. A loose thread that kept getting longer and longer the more he pulled it. He didn't share his initial suspicions with me, and I'm not surprised because I was dead set on our guy with priors being the guilty party. No. He waited until we had the father in for a second round of questioning to drop his own homebrewed bombshell on him. Like I said, we'd already spoken to the father maybe 3 or 4 times before that point, and each time had been informal and friendly. But then Blue Blood makes up some excuse about needing an official statement from him, so he'd have to come down to the precinct so we could tape the conversation. Just a formality. You'd be doing me a personal favor," he said, and the father obliged him. When we were in the interview room, things started as they normally did with the father, all platitudes and well wishes. The father would thank us all for what we were doing, and Blue Blood assured him we'd catch the person who killed his daughter. Only that time, when he said it, it had this strangely different weight to it, and for dramatic effect, he left a little pause after he said it. That's when I realized something was going on. I mean, I already knew because Blue Blood had called him in for questioning, and something definitely was up. But him using the term daughter instead of stepdaughter kept it in the dark in terms of what we already knew, and that's when I realized that something was about to go down. So like I said, the interview started pretty regularly with the father at ease. Well, as at ease as you can get for someone still grieving their daughter. Then, as we're going over the dad's version of events, just one more time for the record, the dad repeats the thing about him stopping to call his daughter's phone. This was supposed to explain why the 16 to 17 minute drive from White Rocks to Mechanicsburg had taken him more like 35 minutes. Blue Blood presses him on this and makes him state for the tape that he wasn't sure how long he stopped, but he drove straight home when he got back on the road again. Blue Blood interrupts him to call him a liar, and in the second that followed, I'm pretty sure I hear the soft thunk of all the jaws in the observation room hitting the floor. The father is obviously pretty outraged and demands an explanation, but all Blue Blood says in response is, "You need an attorney," and suspends the interview so the dad could get one. Everyone thought he'd lost his mind, and I remember his ex-partner fishing out his coffee flask out of his jacket pocket and giving it a sniff on the off chance it had vodka in it or something. Blue Blood was a good cop, and we knew he thought outside the box sometimes, but to screw up what we thought would be an easy case was beyond the pale for many of us. If it was anyone else, the boss would have suspended the interview and switched up the questioning officer, but because it was Blue Blood, no one said nothing, and when the guy's attorney showed up, they just kept rolling the tape. Obviously, because of the implication that the father had lied to us, I'm pretty sure Blue Blood was about to accuse him of having some kind of involvement in his daughter's murder. But the angle he took when the interview recommenced honestly had me questioning reality. Blue Blood basically started listing off all the guys that the daughter had been involved with over the past few years. He said he pulled a whole bunch of raunchy messages from a laptop that they confiscated from her after going through her AOL Instant Messenger. Said since the daughter had such an active romantic life, that it was entirely possible that it was one of her lovers that murdered her. Blue Blood then implied that the father somehow knew this was the case and was wondering why he hadn't mentioned any of the daughter's partners. But there was just one problem with this from where I was standing. It was all complete nonsense. He hadn't pulled anything like inappropriate messages from the girl's laptop, and aside from a few clues into the conversations that seemed to show some sort of rocky father-daughter relationship, it was completely clean. I thought the gravy had slid off Blue Blood's biscuit, I really did. I kept the faith when he'd accused the dad of lying, and he could just smell a lie sometimes. But coming at the case from a completely different angle now, there was an attorney in the room. It certainly didn't feel like we were singing from the same hymn sheet anymore, if you catch my drift. But there he was, just making stuff up about hookups with Taylors and Chads, how Bryce liked to drink and Tommy's teachers said he had a violent streak, just lighting up the dad with a barrage of just complete fiction. And although he wasn't saying anything on the advice of his attorney, you could see something twisting up inside of him, but I'd never have guessed in a million years what that thing was. Because out of nowhere, the dad's demeanor totally changes, and he goes from confused and mad to just furious. Furious like he was about to leap across this table because Blue Blood's words had just triggered something inside of him. She was not seeing anyone. The guy screamed it out so loud even his attorney jumped, and like I said, I was getting ready to put him in a chokehold if he decided to lunge for Blue Blood. But he didn't, and as soon as he opened his mouth, Blue Blood shut up and didn't talk again until there's a seriously uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. I can't remember what he said next, not word for word. He was way smarter than me and had the gift of gab, as they call it, but he basically said, "No, she wasn't seeing anyone. And you know that for certain, don't you, Mr. Ross?" When Blue Blood used this guy's premarital name, the father's face changed completely. "You didn't let her see anyone because you exercised almost complete control over your stepdaughter's life. Your possessiveness had you initiate a relationship with your adult stepdaughter, and for a while, she went along with it. But she'd been looking at colleges, hadn't she? You were afraid you were going to lose her, and that was something you couldn't let happen. You couldn't bear for anyone to think that she wasn't yours. That's why you changed your name, isn't it? You couldn't stand for anyone to think that she wasn't really yours. Your wife wouldn't change her name, not after her first marriage went so horribly wrong, and nothing would convince her. So you changed your name." As Blue Blood kept poking and prodding him, the father looked like he was about to explode. He turned beet red, was shaking like a leaf, and just when his attorney was about to step in to shut Blue Blood up, he erupted. "She was mine. She was always mine. And now she'll be mine forever." Blue Blood left another awkward silence on the tape, then concluded the interview. The father never made a full confession, but shifting the focus to him enabled us to get a whole bunch more incriminating evidence, enough to put him away for 50 years. I thought it might be a huge story in southern Pennsylvania at the time, but I guess the massive post-9/11 news cycle kept it from taking up too many column inches. I didn't find that too surprising, to be honest. I'd known even bigger stories to be kept out of the media for whatever reason, but the case's impact on the public wasn't what preoccupied me in the weeks that followed. It was the case's impact on me as a cop. I realized for my entire career, I've been letting prejudice and emotion degrade my work. You have to come at matters of law enforcement like a robot. Only the evidence matters, not the past or characters of the people in question. And we like to assume that families are good, safe things, and only obviously bad people do bad things. But that's one of the first illusions that's shattered when you become a homicide detective. After that, you just don't quite see the world in the same way. I've actually had stalkers ruin 2 separate Thanksgivings, each about 5 years apart, and the first was at an alarmingly young age, too. I was 13 while he was 12, and we had math class together. Pretty much everyone knew he had this huge crush on me, which wouldn't have been a problem on its own, but this kid was also the biggest perv I've ever met in my life. I know that's quite a bold claim for a 12-year-old, but it was a huge problem at our school for a while. He used to try to look up girls' shorts or grab them in the hallway. He once got caught sneaking into the girls' locker room with one of those old-style flip phones with a camera, too, and I had no idea how he managed to get away with just a few weeks suspension over it. Needless to say, it was no surprise that he began to harass me when he asked me out and I rejected him. He would wait for me in my locker every day and whisper creepy stuff to me as I walked past. Stuff I definitely wouldn't be able to type up word for word because it'd 100% get this taken down. He then started following me to class. Like, I have no idea how, but he worked out exactly what my timetable was, so he was able to basically just track me around school. I told my teachers, the school counselor, the vice principal, but nothing was done against this kid. The best they could do was switch my classes so he'd have trouble tracking me, and that worked for about a week. After that, he escalated and started following me out to the bus. After a while, he'd managed to figure out my schedule, my bus number, my student ID, and was in the process of finding my home address and phone number. Then right when I was at my breaking point, he asked me out again. Like, it wasn't just to get back at me for rejecting him. He honestly thought that harassing me would, bring me around to the idea of dating him. This went on from the beginning of the semester, and right around Thanksgiving time, I actually screamed no in his face. I was just so scared and tired and mad by that point. He actually looked kind of shocked for a second, but then the ugly little worm in him came out and he told me he was actually going to come over to my house on Thanksgiving itself, and he was going to bring a gun to kill me and my whole family. I didn't believe him at first, but he did have a gun, but I had already told my math teacher about it, and cops came over to his house a few days prior to check his thinking, as they put it. And thank God it was just an airsoft gun, and he was obviously just intending to scare me, but if he'd have shown up with that thing, I know for a fact that my dad would have just blasted him without checking if it was real or not. I thought the school would finally expel him after that, and thankfully, that was the final straw for the principal, who had him transferred to a school for kids with behavioral problems shortly after. That was nearly almost 20 years ago now, and I live on the other side of the country, so I'm not too worried about him finding me. But it definitely stuck with me for a long while and seriously colored my opinion in men in a distinctly negative way. My second stalker was a guy I dated in high school. Since we were headed to different colleges, I broke up with him just after graduation, and he basically just went nuts over it. Like actual clinical nervous breakdown type thing. I think that was just leftover stress from the SATs, or how I sort of started to compartmentalize it at first. He got worse and worse as the months went by though, and finally, when I traveled home for Thanksgiving, he tried breaking into my mom's house while we were both asleep upstairs. He stalked me almost everywhere I went, and till I could put together some actual evidence of what he was doing, the cops couldn't do a freaking thing. When I got a new car, he called my work from the business next door and told me my new license plate. He was just relentless. One night he called my house like every minute, on the minute, for almost an hour straight. My parents had to unplug all the phones to get some peace, and my dad called the cops from his cell phone. This all came to a head when he attacked me one day when I was walking downtown that same Thanksgiving weekend. I was with a friend at the time, and he must have gotten a visit from the cops and assumed it was me that called them. He hit me so hard that he almost fractured my orbital socket. And finally, he went to jail for a few months, and that gave me a way out. I moved an hour away, changed my number, got a new job, and blocked him on any social media I had, in addition to lockdown privacy settings. He's moved to a different town and is still wildly unstable. My life has gotten so much better, and I've had so many positive changes, and I hope he never hears about any of it. But there's definitely a little piece of my trauma that I'm not able to let go of. Stuff that just changed you, and you're left constantly looking over your shoulder, carrying a taser, always ready to fight if that one nightmarish person turns up in your life again. Because I know that if he does find me again, he won't give me another chance to get away. He'll kill me. I know he will. So I always have to be ready. I'm a nurse, and a few years back I had to work rotation in the burn unit around Thanksgiving. As you can imagine, there's a sharp uptick in burn victims around certain times of the year, 4th of July being one of them, and Thanksgiving being another. Accidents with fireworks can be pretty nasty, but they're nothing compared to the kind of things you get around Thanksgiving. Plus, there's the fact that shooting and stabbing victims can be surprisingly chill, like they're so hopped up on adrenaline that they can't feel the pain yet, so as patients they can be shockingly cooperative. Burn victims are another thing entirely though. The pain caused by extensive 2nd or 3rd degree burns seems honestly nightmarish, and it really makes me grateful that it's something I've never experienced. I'd never had a patient look me in the eyes and ask me to put them out of their misery, not until I worked the burn unit. Anyway, now that I've set the tone for how messed up the burn unit can be, on with the story. We suddenly get these 2 burn victims in our ICU, one guy and one girl. They're both in terrible states, and they're accompanied by police officers who tell us that the male is a pimp and the female is his, I don't know what to call her. I'll just call her his girl. Apparently the pimp, the girl, and a few of the other pimp's girls tried to have their own little Thanksgiving dinner, with the burn victim being in charge of the cooking. I don't know how it went so wrong, but somehow the girl ended up on fire, But instead of stopping, dropping, and rolling, as I'm pretty sure we're all taught to do, she decided to give her pimp, the same guy who'd set her on fire, this big old bear hug so that he caught fire too. I heard that from another nurse at first, and no offense to her, but I didn't believe a word of it. But then, I hear this one cop basically confirm the story to the presiding consultant, saying that 3 witnesses from the scene all corroborated it, and this was after having been separated. I guess the guy must have just pushed her too far, and when he set her alight, she must have just thought, if I'm going down, I'm taking you with me. This might sound unprofessional of me, but when I heard the girl coded but the pimp survived, this little thought flashed through my mind like, God took the wrong person tonight. It was a real shame, but I don't think she stood a chance, not when we found out she had inhalation burns anyway. Once your lungs are extensively damaged from something like that, either from breathing in flame or toxic smoke, you're pretty much screwed. The pimp, on the other hand, had extremely serious burns to his front torso, face, and arms, but it looked like he was going to pull through. And so much so for natural justice, huh? Well, don't speak or think too soon, because that weasel ended up suffering for what he did. Just not in the way you might think. Obviously, we had to keep the guy in for like a week afterward, all under police guard while being handcuffed to the bed. And the way he looked at me the one time I changed his bandages made my skin crawl. I wasn't there for this, I just heard about it, but one night, the night shift crew hears a bunch of screaming coming from the pimp's room. They initially thought he had some kind of intruder because one of my coworkers told me he was screaming stuff like, get away from me, as loud as he could. Knowing he was a criminal, they're about halfway ready to call the cops when they burst into his room and find no one there. Only the guy is still screaming, get out of here, she's gonna kill me, get her off of me, help. I remember interjecting and being like, nightmare, huh? But she just shook her head, saying his eyes were wide open, and the whole time he was staring at this one spot in the wall, right up until they finally got a doctor's order to sedate him. I'm not one to believe in spirits or ESP or any of that stuff, no offense to the people who do, so I'm not about to claim he was being haunted by the ghost of the girl he'd killed, although that would be pretty sweet, not gonna lie. But saying that, I do think maybe a combo of the medication, not once by mouth, and the trauma of his injuries had him either flashing back or hallucinating that the girl was in the hospital room with him. Like I said, I didn't see any of that, nor do I believe that he was being haunted, but seeing how happy that guy was when he was discharged into police custody, that was honestly one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. I get the guy was in a bad way, physically and mentally, but the hospital to jail transport switchover has a lot of people thinking they can escape. Not that guy. Not only does he not even try, he thanked the cop coming to get him like they were straight up saving him from something. And that's what had me questioning my sanity for a day or two, thinking, is there something else after we die? It's like Scatman Crothers says in The Shining. Maybe there's a lingering after something like that happens. Like the way the smell of burned toast lingers in the air for a while after you burn it. I know it's kind of in bad taste, considering how he died, but maybe something of that poor girl, stayed in the air way after she passed. Or maybe I'm just thinking too much into it. Either way, it was most definitely a Thanksgiving to remember, and one that made me ultra grateful to spend it with my family the following year. One Thanksgiving when I was a kid, my drunk uncle spilled hot gravy on my sister. We were all sitting down to dinner and my uncle straight up sticks his finger in one of the gravy boats and starts complaining that it's cold. My mom tells him she's busy and that if he wanted it hotter, he can microwave it himself. I watched the whole thing happen. He got up, nuked the gravy, staggered back over to the table, then basically emptied out an entire bottle of steaming hot gravy all over my sister's leg. She was only 5 years old at the time, and the noise she made as it started burning her was something I'll never forget. People just jumped into action, pulling my sister's chair back from the table while another rushed to fill up a bowl of cold ice water to douse on the burn. That's how I saw the wound, and it was every bit as hideous as you can imagine. The gravy had basically just burned some of the flesh away, like you could see patches of red, but the burn wasn't bleeding like a cut might do. It looked like a zombie's skin or something, just this big patch of it on my sister's leg. She screamed so loud the neighbors called the cops, and like they didn't even come over to check on us. The screams just scared them so bad that they called the cops instead of EMTs. When the ambulance arrived, they drove my sister to the hospital, and they ended up doing some kind of skin graft too. She healed up okay in the end, but for like a year after, she had this patch of skin that was like a shade lighter than the rest of her. And given that we're like half Latino, mom's from Puerto Rico, it looked extra jarring around the pool that summer. Oh, and we don't talk to that drunk uncle anymore. Not just because of Gravygate, but my mom said that was definitely the beginning of the end for him. And just in case anyone is going to be like, meh, he had a disease. He was still an idiot after he sobered up. Booze didn't seem to have anything to do with it. This might seem kind of tame compared to some of the other stories here, but this is literally one of the most traumatic and terrifying memories of my childhood, and it just so happened to have taken place on Thanksgiving. I remember me and my little brother were upstairs playing in our room while all our relatives were catching up downstairs. Dinner was set to be ready any minute, and we were starving. So, as we're sitting playing Hot Wheels and we get the call that dinner is ready, we just about bolted out of our room and headed for the stairs. My brother was in front of me, but as he started to descend the stairs, I remember his legs just giving out from under him. I remember him reaching up to grab the banister, but it was no good. He tumbled all the way to the bottom, literally just rolling all the way. I think it was so noisy that my parents had come running out of the TV room before he even hit the bottom, and I have this really vivid memory of when he was finally lying still. His eyes were wide open, just this terrified stare in them, and there was this little trickle of blood running out of his ear and down his face. Obviously, everyone went into a blind panic, calling 911, asking what happened, trying to wake my brother up as I sat on the stairs and cried. I say cried. It was probably more like wailing because I swear to God, I thought my big brother had died right there in front of me. Thankfully, he was fine. He just knocked himself out and damaged something in his ear on the way down, but when they kept him in the hospital overnight, I was so scared he was done for. It was that look in his eyes, that sort of half-scared, half-vacant look. I'd never seen anyone get knocked out like that before, and as anyone will tell you, it's pretty scary the first time you see it. And then imagine like you're 4 or 5 and it's your big brother getting slept by a staircase. The moral of the story: don't stand up too fast if you've been sitting down for a while, and if you do, stay away from old wooden staircases. I was house sitting for an older neighbor who had gone off to visit her grandkids a few states over for Thanksgiving. I wasn't going anywhere for it. Long story, no sympathy please, I prefer spending it alone, so I agreed to do it since she had this really sweet cat, so getting to give the thing belly rubs was basically my payment. It turned out to be a pretty nice couple of days too. I poured through all of her old cookbooks, tried out a few of the recipes, and generally just chilled. But one night was pretty intense because I thought my good deed might have ended in me losing my life. So, on Thanksgiving night, I was just relaxing on the couch with the cat when I must have just dozed off, because the next thing I know, I'm waking up to the cat going crazy and yelling at one of the back rooms. I started smiling to myself at first because I'd never before seen a cat be so aggressive and asking to be fed. So I get up, head over to the kitchen, and that's when I start hearing voices in the back of the house. I'm already pretty on edge, since the neighborhood we lived in wasn't exactly the best in terms of crime states, and this is basically prime time for petty thieves. If they'd seen my neighbor's car wasn't there, they might just think the whole place was empty and not even double check, in which case if I happened to startle some armed intruder, that could be the end of me. All the rental properties are laid out the same. You walk in the front door and you're in the living room with the attached kitchen, which was separated by a kitchen counter. Off to the side, you go into the hallway and you have 2 bedrooms on either side with a bathroom or laundry room at the end of the hallway of the house. So I grabbed a knife out of the holder on the counter, pulled my phone out to start dialing 911, then started creeping down the hallway to where I could hear the voices. As I get closer, I hear one of the people freaking out in a whispered voice, which obviously had me even more scared because it meant that they were in a volatile state. I could barely make out what they were saying since they were behind a closed door in one of the bedrooms, but I remember the moment I realized that the voice sounded like it belonged to someone real young, and it sounded like they were holding back sobs. This whole new instinct took over. I flung the door open and flipped on the light, more to see if anyone was hurt or needed help by that time. Then, I'm suddenly greeted by the sight of 2 kids in the room, middle school kids who went to school across the street. It turns out they were in the process of robbing the place when I showed up and they didn't want to go to jail. They thought that they'd be able to sneak away when I went to the bathroom or something, but chickened out because they didn't want to risk getting caught. They sat in that room for hours until nightfall so they could sneak out. It made me kind of sad though. They were kids and their life is going to be a lot more difficult now just because they wanted to be thugs. Still, it scared me a lot though, and it gave me a whole new meaning to Thanksgiving for me. Giving thanks that no one got hurt that night. On Thanksgiving weekend of 2016, like many families in America, the Guy family of Knoxville, Tennessee, convened to have dinner, spend some quality time together, and be thankful for all they had in life. 61-year-old Joel Michael Guy Sr. made his living as a pipeline engineer while his 55-year-old wife Lisa worked as a human resources admin over in Oak Ridge. Their 28-year-old son Joel Jr. had attended Hahnville High School and had later graduated from Louisiana School for Math, Science, and the Arts in 2006. Yet despite his extensive education, Joel Jr. had never once held down a paying job. Instead, he had bounced from college to college, directionless and indecisive, with vague aspirations of being a plastic surgeon. In November of 2016, the Guys had recently sold their Knoxville property and had plans to retire to neighboring Sirgoensville. Thanksgiving weekend of that year would be the final time the Guys held a family event at their Golden View Lane home, and as you can imagine, this gave the occasion a certain weight to it. Joel Sr. and his wife knew that Thanksgiving would be a special one, but instead of being a joyous reunion, it would prove remarkable for completely different reasons. On Saturday, November 26th, with Thanksgiving leftovers dwindling, Lisa Guy went out to pick up some groceries from the local Walmart. Joel Sr. was in her room on the home's second floor, one they used as a kind of exercise room containing a Bowflex, an elliptical, and a few free weights. We can assume he was up there trying to burn off the excess calories that came from double heapings of turkey or pumpkin pie. But what's clear is that the Guy's Thanksgiving weekend was about to be cut short. All of a sudden, the door to the exercise room swung open. In the threshold stood Joel Jr. with a terrifying look of intensity in his eyes, and in his hand, he held a knife. I can only imagine Joel Sr.'s terror as his only son lunged at him, thrusting wildly as he plunged the blade in and out of his father's chest. And although we can't be sure of what his last words would have been, a good guess would be, why? Once his father was dead, Joel Jr. cut the clothes from his father's lifeless body, then arranged them in a pile nearby. Then, when he was done, he simply walked downstairs, sat in the TV room, and waited for his mother to come home. Lisa walked through the front door of her home about an hour later, not having the faintest idea of what had occurred upstairs. She called out to her son and husband, but neither replied. Joel Jr. was no longer in the TV room, and no sound from her husband upstairs. It appears as if both father and son had departed the residence for some reason, yet both of their cars were still parked in the driveway. Confused but not alarmed, Lisa Guy began to walk upstairs to see if her husband had finished working out. It would be her final act on this earth. When she got to the top of the stairs, Her son thrust a knife so deeply into her ribcage that it actually severed several of the bones. Joel Jr. then stabbed her again and again until his mother finally lay still on the carpet beneath him, blood pooling and oozing from the multitude of wounds. Then, just as he'd done with his father, Joel Jr. cut the clothes from his mother's body before her body was placed next to his in the exercise room. It was then that Joel Jr. began the extensive mutilation of his own parents. Joel Jr. took one of the knives in hand and began to cut off his father's hands at the wrists. Once they were severed, he tossed them into the pile of shredded clothes. Joel Jr. then attempted to decapitate his mother, but according to the coroner's report, this was done in a particularly horrifying fashion. You see, the knives that Joel Jr. was using were fantastic at cutting through flesh, but not so great at cutting through thick bone. As a result, it appears that Joel sliced through a huge section of his mother's neck and then proceeded to tear it from its moorings with force. Joel then picked the severed head up, took it downstairs into the kitchen, and began to boil it in a large pot of water. Joel then walked back upstairs to continue the dismemberment. He cut off his parents' limbs, then placed each of their disarticulated body parts into a series of large chemical drums that he'd filled with industrial-strength cleaning chemicals. Yet before he did this, he made sure to partially disembowel each of his parents, which would allow the corrosive chemicals into their abdominal cavities and aid in the rate of decomposition. It's at this point that we realize that this was no spur-of-the-moment crime of passion. Joel Jr. had obviously been reading a great deal about how to quickly and effectively dispose of dead bodies, and given he'd gathered the materials to do so, he'd obviously been planning to kill his parents for quite some time. Yet as much as Joel had taken the time to research his bloody endeavor, he would come to make a grave, singular error. During the attack on his father, Joel Jr.'s hand had slipped on the blade, resulting in a deep cut to his left thumb. At around 3:30 p.m. on the day of the murder, Joel was spotted in the first aid section of the nearby Walmart, buying a variety of medical supplies, as well as some isopropyl alcohol and hydrogen peroxide, which he presumably planned to use to hide the evidence of his crimes. The following day, Joel Jr. went back to his home in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, visiting a student medical clinic there to have the wound to his thumb examined. Both trips would ultimately be used against Joel in a court of law, and it seems that no matter how much planning and research he'd done, his was far from the perfect murder. A few days after she was killed, Lisa Guy failed to show up to her shift at Jacobs Engineering. Her supervisor recognized this as extremely out of character, and when she was unable to contact her at home, called 911 to report Lisa as missing. Long after the 911 call was made, Knox County officers Stephen Ballard and Jeremy McCord pulled up outside 11434 Golden View Lane. The home appeared to be deserted, and there was even a sold sign on the front lawn, but officers noted that there was no real estate lock on the front door. With the officers' curiosity piqued, they walked around to the rear of the home to discover that the back door's handle had been removed, and it appeared that someone then attached it to the front door's handle, possibly in an attempt to render both impassable. The officers then attempted to peer through a window at the front of the house and discovered something strange. The glass, which should have been chilly to the touch, was actually warm. Everyone likes to be cozy during cold winters, but it was so hot and humid in the Guy family home that if anyone was still inside, they'd be horribly uncomfortable. Some of you might be able to guess why Joel Jr. might have cranked up the thermostat before fleeing to Louisiana. But for those of you that can't, part of his research had told Joel that turning up the home's central heating would aid in the decomposition of his parents' dead bodies. And needless to say, when one of the officers began to detect a very distinct odor coming from inside of the house, he knew something foul had occurred. The first thing the officers saw upon gaining entry to the home were money, a sledgehammer, and some firearms laid out on a table. It was only after entering the kitchen that they realized that something was gently simmering on the stove, and upon approaching it, they discovered Lisa Guy's head, bloated and swollen from having spent 2 days in the huge pot. They then discovered Joel Guy Sr.'s dismembered hands on the floor by looking down a hallway, with a further search revealing the corpse-filled chemical drums in an upstairs bathroom. Investigators also found sewer line cleaner, a bag of baking soda, liquid fire brand drain cleaner, muriatic acid, drain opener, lye, food-grade hydrogen peroxide, bleach, and a bleach sprayer, all of which made up the cocktail of chemicals which now ate away at the couple's remains. Investigators also discovered a note in an open suitcase that depicted the name and Louisiana address of an Ace hardware store, along with a notation about sewer line cleaner. The toxic fluid required biohazard equipment for removal by the KCSO hazmat team, and due to the volume of evidence in such a disturbing discovery, KCSO's forensic unit worked throughout the night Monday and into the following day, processing the crime scene. Some said it was the most horrifying crime scene they'd ever come across, and as you can imagine, the discovery generated a huge amount of media attention. Naturally, local law enforcement sought to close the case as quickly as possible, but as forensic investigators combed through the crime scene, they came to a harrowing conclusion. The killer was most likely the couple's own son. Over the days that followed, the FBI, the Knox County Sheriff's Office, and the East Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office placed Guy Jr. under surveillance. They also sought to build a picture of Joel Jr.'s actions in the days leading up to the murder, and what they discovered horrified them. Through analyzing the security camera footage from several local stores, the police were able to identify Joel Jr. as purchasing the very supplies he would use to murder and dispose of his parents. He used cash for every transaction and stuck to self-checkouts to avoid any memorable interactions with staff members. The earliest Joel began to purchase these supplies was November 7th, proving premeditation by at least 2 weeks. Sometime later, Joel bought a U.S. Marine-style K-bar knife from a business known as Academy Sports, the very same knife he would later use to stab his father to death. Then on November 21st, just a few days before the murders, he can be seen at a Knoxville Walmart buying a plastic blue tote large enough for the dismembered bodies to dissolve in. But perhaps the most disturbing piece of evidence was the notebook police found in Joel Jr.'s possessions after he was arrested at his Baton Rouge apartment on November 29th. Not only did Joel have a meat grinder in the trunk of his car, he also had a journal in which he'd written down numerous notes pertaining to the murder. Some of them read as follows: "Get carving knives, killing knives, quiet, multiple. Get sledgehammer, crush bones. Bring blender and food grinder, grind meat to make small pieces. Get bleach, denature proteins. Get plastic sheeting for disposal process. Get plastic bin for denaturation process. Get hollow point bullets, just in case." Joel then seems to correct himself and writes, "Will be seen buying bullets. Just use computer room gun. Check to make sure there are bullets. Last resort. Does not matter where they're killed, just get rid of the bloody spots to prevent evidence of time of death, not the mattress or couches. Don't have to get rid of body if there is no forensic evidence on the body. Get rid of bodies inside house, or DNA already there. Flush chunks down toilet, not garbage disposal. Open up doggy door to provide entryway. Random intruder, needs to be blamed. Flood the house, covers up forensic evidence. Turn heater up as high as it goes, speeds up the decomposition. Bleach reacts with luminol just like blood, douse the whole area with bleach. Body gives time of death, confuse the time of death and my alibi will match. Dad's not alive to claim her half of the insurance, this means the money, all mine, $500,000. Joel had provided the police with all the evidence they needed to send him to prison for the murder of his parents, and his writings provide a terrifying insight into the malicious greed of an ungrateful child who'd rather kill those who brought him into the world instead of just getting a job. Shockingly, even with the weight of the evidence bearing down on him, Joel Guy Jr. pled not guilty to capital murder. Yet at the same time, he filed a motion via his attorney that, if convicted, he immediately would receive the death penalty. Joel also refused to allow either of his defense counsels to prevent evidence on his behalf, meaning that from start to finish, the trial lasted just 4 days, extremely unusual for a multiple murder trial. Despite his wish, following Joel's conviction, a judge refused to hand him the death penalty, assuring him that a more fitting punishment would be to force him to live with the guilt of knowing he'd taken the lives of his own parents. "11 years ago, back when I was just 17 years old, we went to visit some out-of-state relatives for Thanksgiving. This was at a time when I was dyeing my hair a lot, and I'd been experimenting with different shades for at least 18 months. Some were pretty wild, others pretty tame, but my Mima always used to complain at me, saying I was damaging my hair, making it brittle, all the stuff you'd usually expect. I know she was just saying it out of love. She wasn't trying to be mean or anything, but I always used to just roll my eyes and be like, "Okay, Mima, I'll be more careful," then just change the subject. So anyway, we have a nice dinner, fall into various food comas, then all head up to bed after a few hours in front of the TV. But before I head to bed, I decided to take a shower to wash my hair, since I swear that helping my Mima cook left about a gallon of grease in my hair. So with the house completely silent, I head into the bathroom to wash. At first, I just experienced the pure bliss that is a hot shower after a long day. Then I browse through my Mima's collection of shampoos, pick one out, then I got on with washing my hair. At some point, I ran my fingers through my hair, only to find the action met with a little resistance. Not entirely unusual. My hair used to get tangled up a lot, but a hard tug doesn't just magically undo tangles in your hair. I cleared the water from my eyes, looked down, just to see this huge clump of my purple hair between my fingers. Obviously, I'm concerned at this, but I'm not freaking out. Not until I carry on washing my hair and yet another huge clump comes out. At that point, I'm panicking and I just start wildly tugging at the rest of my hair to see if it's just as brittle or damaged as the other clumps. I can't even really describe the horror I felt when almost all of my hair just seemed to fall out of my scalp in a matter of minutes. It didn't hurt or anything, but don't let that fool you. The emotional pain was more than enough to make up for the lack of physical. I remember being in my blind panic, stepping out of the shower and looking in the mirror. Apart from a few loose strands, I was completely and utterly bald. I barely recognized myself. I felt actually physically sick, and by the time I felt like my soul had come back to my body, I just let out this long scream. Half my family came bursting into the bathroom in the seconds that followed, each of them shouting a mixed bag of, "What's wrong? What happened? Are you okay? What did you do to your hair?" I just cried for like an hour straight, shaking and wailing and just totally unable to compute what had happened. It was honestly like a living nightmare, and when I realized it was probably an indication that I was in poor health, I became convinced that I was dying. I was so depressed that my mom had to basically drag me into the shower, force feed me tea hose, then take me down to the doctor's office to get me checked over. We found out what the issue was, and although it wasn't life-threatening, it took me literally months to come out of what was the darkest and most crushing depression of my life. An acute, sudden autoimmune reaction, the doctor said. Pretty much overnight alopecia. Well, not so much overnight. I'd noticed I was losing a bit more hair than usual, but like Mima said, the almost constant cycle of bleaching and dyeing had definitely damaged my hair a little, but having it all come out in almost one fell swoop was crushing. I lost almost all my body hair too, which wasn't nearly as rough as the hair on my head, but I still felt like a total freak in the months following Thanksgiving. As horrible as this all sounds, I'd like to reassure everyone that there's definitely been something of a happy ending, or rather, that there's some serious silver lining in my condition. Good wigs are expensive, sure, but I can now have a different hair color for each day of the week, all without the lengthy dyeing process. I also save a ton of time and hassle in shaving my legs, among other things, and as much as the whole losing my hair thing sucked, I basically looked at it like nature's laser hair removal. The point being, our bodies can scare the life out of us, but whatever you're going through, this too shall pass. You just gotta be strong and find those silver linings. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data. Located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and have a happy and safe Thanksgiving.